Hello again. Once again, this is Scott Johnson. This is the Dad on Rails podcast, where I attempt to deliver lectures that might be useful for my son who is learning web development and specifically learning on Ruby on Rails to work on projects with me. Because after all, in the age of COVID, what do you do but learn to do new shit? Oh no, I said a bad word. I'm sorry. Okay. Anyway, I have called this podcast Dad on Rails because the language that I use mostly is Ruby, and I use it mostly in a Ruby on Rails context. All right. And in this podcast, I'm going to tell you why I love Ruby on Rails. Okay? And I should note that I don't love it because it's the only thing I know. I also know how to program in Python, Basic, Elixir, Rust, Z80 assembler once upon a time, some level of C, etc. I've been doing this stuff forever. I know a whole bunch of tools. However, I have never found a tool that I love more than Ruby on Rails. Right? So I'm gonna gush, and I'm gonna tell you why Ruby on Rails is, in my heteronormative fashion, the prettiest girl I ever took to the dance. Okay. I started putting stuff on the web in like 93, 94. All right? And at that point, it was mostly HTML. It was mostly just collections of data organized in a particular way. We used to do CD-ROM publishing back in the day, and we helped our clients take their CD-ROMs and put them on the internet. So there was no language per se. And then, the real internet happened circa 96 boom, and I discovered the world of web programming, and it was good. And I used a variety of techniques. I used some Cold Fusion, I used some PHP, I used some PTF or print time formatting back in the day. Another story there to come later. And then came the .com explosion, where I did mostly SQL Server stuff and Microsoft ASP. And then the internet blew up. The .com revolution failed, and everybody, including me, was out of work. And when I went back to it, when somebody came to me and said, "Hey, you're smart, I need some code written," I picked up PHP. And I picked up PHP mostly because it was free. Okay? And I used PHP from 2002 to 2006, and I used it intensively. I gave talks on PHP, and I really, really liked it. And you know what? PHP is a good language subject to its limitations. And then along came Ruby. Okay? And Ruby is pretty. Ruby is shiny. And the lovely thing about Ruby is it's well designed. Okay. Now, I'm going to compare and contrast. And this is going to be an implementation choice. I'm going to talk about why I'm going to get to Ruby on Rails, right? Which is Rails is the framework on top of the Ruby language. But in order to explain why I like Ruby so much, I have to talk about why PHP made some mistakes along the way. PHP was written by a guy named Rasmus Lerdorf, and Rasmus is a fantastic software developer, but he didn't set out to write a language. He set out to write a tool for making personal home pages, hence PHP, personal home page. When you write a personal home page, what you want is the ability to do something with it. Like at the bottom of the page, you might want to put the ability to insert the time in. Okay? And so what Rasmus did, being a good Unix programmer, is he wrote basically a tool that took in a template of data, right? So basically an HTML template, and looked for tokens, okay? So that angle question mark syntax you see in PHP, and then did something like he had a time command that did nothing but mapped onto the Unix time command. And it accepted all of the arguments in the Unix time command because it wasn't much different. It was just literally a layer on top of it, just a way to call a local Unix executable. And because he was just writing a mapping, he used the same syntax order for the way the native Unix executables worked. So if you had a search executable or a TR executable, it would take, whether it was subject comma argument or argument comma subject, he just followed the way the underlying executables worked. And then, to hear Rasmus tell it, and he tells a great story, somebody asked me for an if statement, and I said, sure, I can write an if statement, I'm a smart programmer. He wrote an if statement. And then someone said, I need a loop construct. And he said, I can write a loop construct. And then he said, I was doomed from that point forward. Because once you have logical testing and iteration, loops, you are what is referred to as a Turing complete programming language, at which point it will then forevermore be a language. And his tool literally morphed under him into a language. And I know this is true because in 1991, yep, I had a software engineer working for me named Gene Callahan. And Gene, who's now a computer science professor, because he's just that smart, was working on a tool for me to convert documents into online documents. So we had and Gene, and what I told him was, hey Gene, I need the ability to take and find a pattern in a document, and I needed to output a heading tag, right? Because what our software did at the time was we took heading tags and we converted them to web pages, and then we will build links out to the heading tags. And Gene, being a smarter guy than I am, realized that what I was asking for was actually a language, and so he wrote, the sneaky bastard that he was, he wrote me a language that was generated that generated a tool. Gene is a good computer scientist, and I suspect an absolutely excellent professor. I've never taken one of his classes, but I wish I could. So I have seen this. You start with the desire to build a tool, and then you realize the problem is actually more generalized, so you write a language. I have seen this before. So Ruby. Ruby is a language starting in roughly 1996, I believe, or 1995, by a guy named Mats. And Mats is Japanese, okay? And the core Ruby mailing lists often have Japanese content in them because the core dev team is Japanese. And Ruby as a language is unique in that it is written in Japan. There's not a lot of software languages, to my knowledge, that come out of Japan. Now that may simply be cultural bias, but I haven't seen a lot of them. Okay, and that partly it might be also because I don't speak Japanese, right? So I'm missing, I'm sure, stuff that happens in Japan. Anyway, Ruby is what's called an object-oriented language, and what object-oriented means is that the underlying thing that you work with in Ruby is called an object. And when something is an object, that usually means it can respond to what are called messages. Okay? So everything in Ruby is an object, and Ruby is what's called a pure object-oriented language because everything literally is an object. The number 2 in Ruby is an object of class integer. Okay? And Ruby, and every object in Ruby will respond to a message, and it has what's called a method missing facility. Okay? And the fact that Ruby is a pure object-oriented language makes using it glorious because everything has what are called uniform semantics. Everything can be done the same way. Okay? You know, you have an object, you send it a message. The way you send it a message is you apply a dot to it, and then you specify the message. So if I want to know is the number 1 an even number, I type it in a Ruby interpreter. I can type 1, period, even, question mark, press enter, and I will get back either true or false. That question mark will come back to. All right. So I love Ruby, but there is one disadvantage to Ruby. Ruby, as a pure object-oriented language, is not the fastest lady at the dance, right? So if Ruby was breakdancing, Ruby be doing this. Right? Or whatever breakdancing looks like. I.e., Ruby is slow as a language because that facility where everything's an object, right down to core numbers, and everything in computer languages always comes down to numbers, people. And the fact that everything can trap what's called method missing, okay, that has a performance overhead. Now, as a general rule of thumb in computing, what you optimize for is you always optimize for developer productivity, because computers get faster year over year, but the number of developers and the number of good developers increases relatively slowly. So making developers productive is really, really important. And when a language is good like Ruby, I would argue it makes developers productive. Now, mind you, the people out there who are Ruby haters, I hear your pain. I have fought the Ruby performance wars and I have lost to them. I have seen the problems with method missing, etc. I get that. Go away. This isn't your place. This is an introductory podcast, and it is not the time or the place for that. Or video cast, whatever the hell this is. Okay, so now we are going to talk about, so we talked about Ruby, we talked about why I love it. I love it because it is a uniform syntax, and I love it because it is elegant, okay? And the Ruby syntax is so simple and so elegant that I can literally write it without using, I can write it using speech without actually having to put things in place. So let's talk about Ruby the language, and let's say that we have an array. So we're going to start with a simple thing called an array. What is an array? An array is a collection of items. Okay? And in particular, an array is a data structure that is ordered, okay? And it can contain, generally speaking, at least in Ruby, an arbitrary number of items. And the way you represent an array in Ruby is a square brace. And so if we were to, let's write some Ruby in the sky. So we're gonna go into a Ruby console, and we can do this by typing the word IRB at our command line. Okay? And now you type the word fruits, F-R-U-I-T-S, all lowercase, space equals space, square bracket, and then you put in a series of strings. A string is a set of characters delimited by quotation marks, either single or double. And so we're going to say, quote, apple, quote, comma, quote, berry, quote, comma, quote, orange, quote, comma, quote, kiwi, K-I-W-I, quote, and then put a square bracket. Press enter. You, dear listener, have just written your first array. It is bound to the variable name fruits, and now you can do things with it. So you could type in fruits, period, sort, and that will give you back a list sorted by name. Okay? You could say fruits, square bracket, 0, press enter, and that will give you back that first element, in which in this case would be apple. Now, Ruby strives to be a high-level language. And what a high-level language means is it strives to do things the way humans sort of do it. This is not to say that it is English. It is by no means English. I can easily write Ruby that even I cannot understand. But let's say, for example, you want that first element out of the array. And I gave it to you already by saying fruits bracket 0, which basically says, give me the data in the fruits array that is stored at position 0, or I could have said fruits period first, which would also give you apple. Right? But now I'm going to talk about the most magical thing about Ruby, I think. And the reason why I so like Ruby. When you work with computers, you always end up working with collections of things because computers allow you to deal with collections. And Ruby makes collections simpler than I have ever experienced in any other language in my life. So the syntax for this, so let's give us a problem. So we have a collection of fruits. They're all stored in the fruits variable, and I just want to put them all out. Now, in other programming languages, you could use a while loop or a for loop, etc. And Ruby has while loops and for loops. I have been doing Ruby now since 2006. It is 2020, so that's 14 years. And I have been doing Ruby at scale, i.e. I do Ruby every damn day, and I do multiple things with Ruby because I'm mostly a consultant. I have written a while loop in Ruby, I think maybe 3 times, and a for loop maybe twice. So the way you mostly deal with iteration in Ruby is you deal with it with what's called a dot each. So you do fruits dot each do pipe space pipe fruit pipe enter puts fruit enter end. When you type that all in, what will happen is Ruby will loop over the fruits collection, and it will put or print to the screen the word fruit. Actually, not the word fruit, but the type of fruit that's in the array. And you can do that now, and I'll give it to you again. Fruits.each space do space pipe fruit pipe. Pipe is the upper character. It's usually on the right-hand side of the keyboard. Enter. PUTS space fruit. And then end, right? And you don't have to worry about indexes. You don't have to worry about counters or offsets. Oh, sorry about that. And that's how simple that iteration is in Ruby. And this dot each do syntax is magical. It's simple. It's consistent. I have so rarely had problems that I don't even think about it. And this eliminates a whole class of programming errors that are normally associated with iteration. Off by ones, off by zeros, going too far, going not too far, etc. It all goes away. Dot each do is pure damn magic. Okay? And I know it seems like I'm focusing on something simple as opposed to something complex like, oh, it makes making RESTful APIs easy. And it does. Ruby on Rails absolutely does. But everything you do with a computer will always involve some kind of collection. And if you make that fundamental thing easy, you eliminate a whole class of bugs, right? They'll just never, ever happen because you have this simpler approach, okay? And I have employed programmers since I was 19 years old, and programmers make mistakes. I am a programmer. I make no end of mistakes, but at least I tend not to make this mistake. All right. So, we are now going to continue why I love Ruby on Rails, why I have been so gobsmacked by Ruby on Rails that I have stuck with the same basic programming model since 2007. All right. So, the first thing to understand is that I am a consultant, and as a consultant, this means you are dropped into different projects. One of the advantages that Ruby on Rails has is when something is written as a Rails app, generally speaking, it is written the same damn way as every other Rails app. This means I can be dropped into a project and hit the ground and start running. And for my clients, that is useful because I bill out at a high rate, okay? I bill out well north of $100 an hour, right? Because I'm good at what I do. And so whether it's an online dating system, yep, I've written those in Ruby on Rails, or a disease tracking system for COVID, yep, did that, or analytics on mobile applications, yep, did that, or oncology detection for cancer, doing some pretty sophisticated math, yep, did that. All these things can be built in Rails, and each of those Rails apps will look and feel exactly the same. Okay, and I don't mean look and feel at the level of the look of the UI, right? I mean look and feel at the level of the underlying, how do I approach a problem, right? When now Rails is what's called an application framework, right? And the full name is Ruby on Rails. And what this means is that they took and they wrote a whole bunch of stuff around the Ruby language and brought in a level of consistency, okay? And they gave you a set of facilities to tackle the common denominator problems that you have on the web, which are mostly, honestly, web database problems, okay? Now, Ruby on Rails was written by a Danish programmer named DHH, David Hanemeyer Hansen. And DHH is a very outspoken guy. He's DHH on Twitter. He's worth following. And what DHH did was, back in the dawn of prehistory, is he was working for a company that did web design, and they had a problem managing client engagements. And in specific, they had to track, like, what do we do here, etc. And it wasn't quite ticketing, and it wasn't quite workflow management. It was the whole schlemiel. And so he wrote an internal tool called Basecamp. And Basecamp was good. And they realized that they could do web development for dollars, or they could build products. In specific, they could sell access to Basecamp itself. And so they did. And then they realized, well, we need to build something else. We want to use the same tools we already built. We will pull the code out of Basecamp and make it universal. And thus was born the Rails application framework. So the first thing to note is the reason why Rails is good is because it is fundamentally based in the world of practicality. It was extracted from something that worked, as opposed to written from the ground up to build something new. I am a fan of work and people who do the work. And I know one listener is smiling now. Hello, I know who you are. When you have practicality as sort of a core mantra, you tend to end up with something that's better, in my opinion. Okay? And I say this having written an application framework myself that I tried to do from scratch, which was a miserable failure. Yep, that was my 2005. I'm sorry. Or 2006, actually. Anyway, the first thing I like about Rails, it's very practical because it was extracted from something that was already successful. Second thing I like about Rails is it is designed to let you do things quickly. So if you go look at the website covidnearme.org, that whole website was initially stood up in less than 2 days' time, including the database design, the parsing of the data from Johns Hopkins, and the underlying build architecture, and the overall display. Now, covidnearme.org does a whole lot more stuff now than it used to, but overall, the whole thing was built in less than 2 days, and it was done 2 days over a weekend getaway. Okay, Rails, once you learn it, lets you do things faster than anything else on the planet, I believe, mostly because Rails has a sensible and rational set of defaults, and it makes a sensible and rational set of assumptions. Okay. Next thing that I like about Rails is Rails recognizes a design principle that I call iterative design. Okay. I exist in a world where my clients can rarely, if ever, tell me exactly what they want done. They can give me a general direction. I want to build a system that does X, but they cannot tell me specifics. And that's okay, because the idea of telling you everything that you want done is called waterfall design. And waterfall design is old school, and it doesn't tend to work. I follow a design philosophy called Agile. And Agile means basically work in small chunks of work, usually called tickets, work quickly in cycles that are called sprints, and continuously keep the system running and building towards a goal. Rails is excellent at this, at least partly because at the database layer of Rails, they have adopted what's a facility called migrations. And migrations are a way to build a table of data and then make changes to it even though the system is already running. And yes, Rails haters out there, I know the issues with migrations and large tables. Go away, okay? Love ya. You're right. It's a pain. Use OnCane strong migrations if this is an issue. Anyway, I believe heavily in iterative design, okay? And Rails really supports that by being fast, by allowing data to change structure, and being flexible overall. Rails doesn't sort of lock you in anything. Next thing I love about Rails is the defaults are usually good, okay? And Rails is what DHH refers to as an opinionated web framework. And DHH loves his opinions. And I respect the man for it, because if you don't have opinions, why do you exist? Anyway, but DHH said most people in the world, they're going to build a web app. And that web app is going to display HTML. And that web app is going to have a database. And that database is going to have some defaults. Bada bing, bada bang. And a whole series of defaults that are generally rational and sane came into being. Okay? So when you use Rails, you can pretty much pick it up and start going. Okay? And it will, generally speaking, tackle the common out-of-the-box criteria that you need right away. All right, now, I have used the expression Rails haters or Ruby haters a couple times, and I will talk a little bit about that. When you are successful in the world, people will love to detract from you or pick on you. And Rails hit the computing world in 2005, hit the world running and became the new hotness. And then it started to show some problems, particularly around scalability. And Ruby is slow, and a lot of Rails things aren't always well designed, and that created a general mantra that Ruby can't scale and Rails can't scale. And from that, we got the whole Node.js movement, which Node is scalable. Yeah, scalable if you can do asynchronous callback programming. Yeah, good luck with that. That shit sucks. Again, I optimize for developer time because developer time is more important than anything else. And lest you say that Rails can't scale, I would encourage you to go look at GitHub, one of the largest websites on the internet, written in Rails. Shopify, one of the largest websites on the internet, again written in Rails. Airbnb, mostly written in Rails. You have something like Twitter, which was originally written in Rails, and Twitter did not scale in Rails. Twitter barely scales in anything, right? Twitter produces 500 million tweets a day. Nothing easily scales at that level. And quite honestly, scaling is always hard, okay? So to tackle the detractors, there's two basic objections people have to Ruby on Rails. One is Rails can't scale, and that's crap. Rails can scale just fine, you simply have to work at it, and that's true in any language, any tool. There is no magic bullet for scalability, okay? I have scaled things in the large, and I know how to do it, but there is no magic bullet. Okay. the next thing to know is the other reason people rag on Rails is Ruby as a language is it's an object-oriented language. It's very dynamic, and this is a blessing and a curse. Okay, I view it mostly as a blessing, but I have been gifted by it as a curse. So Ruby, you can change anything at runtime. Okay, so you can literally redefine plus so that plus adds numbers together, except when the numbers are 3 and 5, in which case it will return 7. You can do anything you want in Ruby. This is very, very powerful and also very, very dangerous. And there are a bunch of bad development practices that you can engage in Ruby, what are called monkey patching, whereby you change the underlying system the wrong way and it becomes unstable. This is a real thing, okay? Personally, I would prefer to have the ability to do that than not, but it depends on where you fall along the axiom of control versus non-control. I like to have control in my life, and I find that Ruby gives me a lot of it, and yes, Ruby can literally kill me, but I like to have that option, okay? Other people want the world to be more restricted because they view that gives a safer way to design big systems. Both are true. Okay? Like all complex things in the world, there is no one answer. Okay. Why else do I like Rails? Rails lets me be productive. It lets me be productive very quickly. Generally speaking, what I have found is that Rails feels good to me because it creates a virtuous cycle. Rails lets me iterate quickly. I can iterate quickly, and thus I can do things. I can get feedback to my clients more quickly, and thus they can give me answers back, and I get this virtuous feedback cycle. Okay? And when you find a development tool that gives you that, and sometimes that might be Rails, and sometimes that might not be, you will, generally speaking, I have found as a programmer, be happy, right? Look for that fast-paced development cycle. Okay. The other thing I like about Rails, I have made money with Rails. I have been a consultant using Rails since 2007 mostly. Most of my gigs have been as a consultant, and I have made bank. So, bank. Now, if you notice, I didn't really talk all that much about different features within Rails. I could have, for example, talked about how Active Record lets me interface to any database, and it does. I could talk about how ERB views let me easily view things. I could have talked about the component registry, gems, how they let me pull in any functionality that I need that someone else has written. I could have talked about the ability to build JSON APIs. I could have talked about any number of things, okay? I do not need to talk about those because the underlying characteristics of Rails as a framework outweigh the specific bits, bytes, and megabytes type features, okay? And that is why I love Ruby on Rails. I will talk to you later. Thank you.